I can't guarantee that Ben Johnson is going to be a great head coach, but so much about this hiring feels different than the past Chicago Bears coaching failures.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I cover the Bears for Sports Illustrated, and I've been covering the Bears for the Locked On Podcast Network for over 7 years now. I really appreciate you tuning in to Locked On Bears and making us your first listen. Whether this is your first ever listen to Locked On Bears, or whether it's your 500th listen to the podcast, we appreciate you being a part of the conversation. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on the show today, we got to react to the Ben Johnson news. The Bears land their guy, and why this feels different, why you're allowed to have hope for Ben Johnson being something more than previous Bears head coaching hires have proven to be over time. So part of that is going to be the Bears' pursuit of him. Part of that is the coaching staff he's assembling and the position that this puts the Bears team in moving forward. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. And I think we're all looking around today, pinching ourselves a little bit, and maybe in a little bit of disbelief that the Bears actually got their guy, got the top guy in the coaching search, because that's the first thing that feels distinctly different here than previous Bears head coaching searches. Ben Johnson is the candidate that seemingly every other team wanted, or at least most other teams wanted. The Las Vegas Raiders and Tom Brady were hot on Ben Johnson and trying to do everything in their power to bring him into the Sin City. The Jacksonville Jaguars were going hard after Ben Johnson and really wanted to pair him with Trevor Lawrence. I think some of the other teams in the head coaching search got the impression that they weren't as high on Ben Johnson's list, so maybe they kind of backed out a little bit. But you ask around the NFL and around fan bases, this was the consensus top guy. Most fans of most teams who have a head coaching opening wanted their team to hire Ben Johnson. And the Bears don't usually land that guy. When you think back to previous Bears head coaching searches, you can even just look right at Matt Eberflus or even, Mark Trestman and stuff before that. Like, the Bears hire a coach, usually it's a guy that, okay, he was a pretty good assistant coach or something, and there's a few things to like, and maybe he'll be a good coach. But, he's not like some out-of-this-world candidate. It's kind of a second or third choice type of vibe is usually what the Bears get. Not with Ben Johnson. They pulled him away from the Raiders. They pulled him away from the Jaguars. They got the coach that everybody else wanted. And I know some people will point to, when the Bears hired Matt Nagy, he was a pretty hot coaching candidate, having worked with Patrick Mahomes and under Andy Reid. But even Matt Nagy came with a lot of question marks about his offense too, having not been the play caller in Kansas City. That was part of the, I guess, the downside or the risk with the hiring of Matt Nagy at the time that gave some people pause. Not that Ben Johnson doesn't have any questions or downside or risk or whatever, but I think there's a lot fewer question marks about what Ben Johnson does on offense than what Matt Nagy does on offense. Both coaches carry some questions about how good of a head coach will there be. We've seen Ben Johnson be a great offensive coordinator. We've never seen Ben Johnson be a head coach. So that doesn't mean, just because he was a great offensive coordinator, doesn't mean he'll be a great head coach. But we didn't know how great of an offensive coordinator Matt Nagy was. We just knew he was underneath Andy Reid. And so I think while Ben Johnson's green flags can give you a lot of confidence and faith in him as a head coaching hire, it does not guarantee he's going to be a great head coaching hire. But I do think it protects us in a way where Bears fans are never going to be able to look back some years in the future and say, oh man, the Bears really should have hired this other candidate, that we should have known at the time that the Bears got the wrong guy. Maybe sometimes with previous Bears head coaching hires, they hire somebody and like, ooh, that wasn't really who I wanted or who you thought they should want, and there was this other candidate that would have been so much better. That doesn't exist right now. Ben Johnson is it. You won't look back and have the Mark Trestman, Bruce Arians debate about, if only they had hired that other guy. A lot of people wanted them to hire that other guy, but they didn't hire the guy everybody wanted. This time, they hired the guy that everybody wanted, and we just haven't seen that happen much at all in recent Chicago Bears history. That gives me so much more confidence in saying, I don't know if it's going to work, but this is their best shot toward being able to make it work. There's something to be said about the wisdom of the crowd here and being the team that everyone else wanted to be in this coaching cycle. The other green flag that jumps out at me outside of Chicago here is if you look at the reaction of especially Green Bay Packers fans, but also Minnesota Vikings fans and Detroit Lions fans. This is the coach Packers fans did not want the Chicago Bears to hire. This is the coach Minnesota Vikings fans did not want the Chicago Bears to hire. And certainly the Detroit Lions didn't want Ben Johnson staying within the division. Usually when your enemies, quote unquote, aren't a fan of a move that you make, it's usually a good sign that you probably made a good move, or at least made a smart process decision, right? Again, doesn't guarantee results, but it's the decision that everyone was afraid that you would do because they don't want you to do good things. The people who don't want you to do good things think you did something good here, right? They're not gaslighting you. It's not a biasy thing. It's like they're worried. They're upset. They wanted Ben Johnson out of the division. The Bears kept him in the division and are also making some moves with and around Ben Johnson that's attracting the ire of other NFC North fans around this. And when it comes to the coaching staff that Ben Johnson is putting together, I want to talk about that in a little bit here and some of the other things in this process that strike me as why this feels different. Not just about Ben Johnson as the candidate, but also how the Bears have gone about hiring Ben Johnson as their head coach. If you want more in-depth on Ben Johnson's background and why he is and has been the best candidate for the Bears this cycle, go back and take a listen to our podcast that came out on Friday, either here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts, because we ranked the head coaching candidates and went in depth on why Ben Johnson was the top guy. And on tomorrow's podcast, we're going to talk to a friend of mine who's a Detroit Lions reporter about Ben Johnson and his offense and what Lions fans loved about him, what he did so well in Detroit, and maybe where Bears fans should be keeping an eye out for where he needs to get better or what things we should be watching out for as he transitions from offensive coordinator to head coach. We'll get the Lions' perspective with Jeff Risdon of the Lions Wire on tomorrow's podcast on Ben Johnson. So we're going to do some more deep dives on Johnson. He's going to be the focus of conversation all week. But for now, I want to step back and look at one of the other green flags here. One of the early encouraging signs that make this feel different is the first names populating his Bears coaching staff. As of the time I'm recording this, nothing is guaranteed yet, but he's bringing exactly what Ryan Poles was looking for, and all sounds pretty smart and stable to me. We'll take a look at the potential impacts of maybe Dennis Allen and maybe Darren Rizzi next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I have the Gametime app on my phone, and I use it all the time. I buy concert tickets on Gametime. I go see comedians on Gametime. I've been to theater shows on Gametime. I've been to Bears games using the Gametime app. It is the best place to buy tickets on the secondary ticket market. And I love live in-person entertainment. It is just so much better than anything else you can watch through your screen. And Gametime makes it super easy to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I love that with Gametime, they have panoramic seat views, so you can see what you're getting with your ticket purchase before you buy your tickets. And you can also toggle all-in pricing, so you don't get any of the added surprise fees at checkout. You get the total cost up front. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Ben Johnson is going into his first ever head coaching job very intentionally. He has been someone who's bided his time, waited for the right opportunities, but has been working towards this for a little while yet. He's done interviews for a couple of years, but kind of been sitting and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. And having all that time to prepare, I think, is helping Ben Johnson come to Chicago with a great plan on the front end. And I think it's going to be a really important part of this process, how he surrounds himself with coaches. Yes, he's going to be the offensive play caller. Yes, he's got to be in charge of setting the culture and being a leader and communicating and being the guy that everyone looks to in all the big moments. But he can't do everything himself. And he's going to need, especially on the defensive side of the ball, someone else to really pay some extra attention to manage that and sort of be, if he's sort of the offensive coordinator as head coach, he might need a defensive coordinator as head coach, a head coach of the defense to be in charge of that side of the ball with maybe a little less input from Ben Johnson comparatively to other coaches that might be more hands-on with both sides of the ball. He may need to be more hands-on on offense and more hands-off on defense. And so we get reporting not long after the Bears make the hire that the leading candidate to be the Chicago Bears defensive coordinator is none other than former New Orleans Saints head coach Dennis Allen. And at the same time, the Bears are also heavily pursuing former Saints interim head coach Darren Rizzi as their special teams coach. Now, the Bears have to, I think there's rules actually, that they have to conduct interviews for those positions. So it's not like Ben Johnson can just show up on Tuesday and say, these guys are hired, hand them contracts. Like, I think there's a formal process they have to go through that at this point is kind of more of a wink and a nod and an elbow and a nudge. But still, like, there's a reason why I think the language Adam Schefter uses there is that, Dennis Allen is expected to be the top candidate Bears are pursuing. That's their way of saying they can't officially say Dennis Allen will be the defensive coordinator. They can't officially say Darren Rizzi will be the special teams coordinator, but he's saying they're going to be once they actually go through this process. And okay, like right away you could say, well, Dennis Allen sucked as a head coach for the Saints, and Dennis Allen sucked as a head coach for the Las Vegas Raiders. Why should we be so excited about him being the Bears' new defensive coordinator? And it's worth noting, like, when he was before he became the Saints head coach, he was the Saints defensive coordinator. And they had 4 years in a row ranking as a top 10 defense in New Orleans and never ranked lower than 19th with him as their defensive coordinator. They were always consistently good defenses. He's someone, and we're going to go more in depth on Dennis Allen and Darren Rizzi in the coming weeks, or the coming days here on the podcast. We're going to talk to Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints about Dennis Allen and Darren Rizzi. But just as an overview right now, coached good defenses, creative in mixing up his fronts to generate a pass rush. Like, he's not like the world's most aggressive, like blitzer, for example. Like, yeah, they blitz sometimes, but this is not, Brian Flores and the Minnesota Vikings. Like, if you look at the Saints' blitz rates, they tend to kind of hover down around where the Bears' blitz rates have been, where, not the very bottom of the NFL, but they tend to be a little bit more of a four-man rush type of team. But it always kind of fluctuates a little bit year to year and can depend on, how much pass rush talent they have versus how much they think they need to send extra pass rushers. But they like to stunt and twist and show different looks at the line of scrimmage. And he likes to disguise coverages on the back end. They definitely will play a lot more man coverage under Dennis Allen than what we've seen under Matt Eberflus, but it's not like it's going to be all man coverage, and they're able to mix some things up on the back end there as well. And then Darren Rizzi has been an interim head coach now for the Saints and is a well-respected special teams coordinator who's now has some of that head coach experience under his belt, coached special teams in New Orleans and Miami before that, where he worked with Ben Johnson. There's a lot of familiarity with him and this coaching staff. And that's one of the big green flags here. Because do you remember when Matt Eberflus was hired by the Chicago Bears? Yeah, he brought in a bunch of his Colts defensive coaches. But when Matt Eberflus was putting together his offense, he hired Luke Getsy, who he had never worked before, his quarterbacks coach Andrew Janocko, he had never worked with before, his offensive line coach Chris Morgan, he had never worked with before, his running backs coach something Walker was the guy they fired for HR violations. He brought in a bunch of offensive coaches that he had never actually worked with before, and it felt like it was too many cooks in the kitchen with a lot of different ideas from a lot of different backgrounds that couldn't all align in one offensive identity. Ben Johnson is bringing in guys he knows with experience, and that's something specific that Ryan Poles talked about before they hired Ben Johnson. At the end of the season, when Ryan Poles met with the media, he was asked about, okay, do you hire a first-time head coach who's only been a coordinator versus do you hire someone who's been a head coach before, and what kind of things do you need to see there? And listen to Ryan Poles' answer here about what he would want to see from a first-time head coach, and think about Ben Johnson and think about Ryan Poles talking about Ben Johnson here with Dennis Allen and also potentially Darren Rizzi.
What is the value you put on experience at the head coaching level versus how you project an assistant to be, given that Matt Eberflus was an assistant and maybe some of the traits you thought would translate did not?
Yeah, it's a great question. When you look at that, good coaches come from different places, different backgrounds. How are you supplementing your blind spots, your void? So if you're a first-time head coach, what can we put in place for you to help support you? What do the coordinators look like? Are they former head coaches? You have an advisor that's a head coach that's at your right side to pick up some of the blind spots to say, hey, you might want to take care of this. This could turn into something later, or I think you might be missing here. So how are you supporting some of those blind spots if you are a first-time coach? If you have been a head coach before, yeah, there's a lot of value because some of the new things, like you've already experienced those, you've been around it, and you have kind of the playbook and the blueprint on how to counter things when they go away from you, or when you have success, how do you make sure that everyone stays humble and they continue to work and get better?
Now, when Ryan Poles said that right after the regular season, I'm assuming he didn't know Ben Johnson would try and bring Dennis Allen with him, but maybe Ben Johnson heard that and said, oh, okay, I'll bring Dennis Allen with me to really sell the Bears on the job. I mean, you never know, but it definitely sounds like, yes, get a coordinator who has head coaching experience. Even if Allen wasn't a great head coach, he's just been through things before. So if Ben Johnson is like, he knows how to run an offense and everything, but if there's a head coaching type of situation where he's like, man, I don't know exactly what to do here. Can I just pick Dennis Allen's brain? Not that he's going to do exactly what Dennis Allen would do, because maybe Dennis Allen made mistakes in those spots. But at least he can go to Allen and be like, hey, have you ever been in this situation before? What would you do? Or what did you do? And then he can say, okay, that makes sense. And I'm going to take that and then maybe tweak it slightly and then do it my way, but based on experience that you've been through before. Or Dennis Allen can point out and say, hey, Ben, I noticed you're not doing this. And I think as a head coach, you should probably be doing that. And Ben Johnson can say either, yes, good idea, I'll do that, or no, actually, there's a reason I'm not doing that, and here's why. But as Ryan Poles says, it's a good way to call out blind spots and to have somebody in that role that you can trust, that can mentor you, that has been through it before, even if they're not the head coach now. That's a great sign of someone recognizing that they may have blind spots or weaknesses, or having somebody else in there to give them a better perspective on that for themselves. That's another one of these green flags for Ben Johnson as to why this hiring feels different than previous Bears head coaching hires. Matt Nagy brought in Vic Fangio. Fangio hadn't been a head coach up to that point. Fangio was an experienced defensive coordinator, but there wasn't a former NFL head coach on that Bears staff. I guess Mark Helfrich, the offensive coordinator, had been a college head coach, but it's just not quite the same thing there. So that's where it starts to feel like, to me, this is something that can and should be different this time around with Ben Johnson, because it was different with how the Bears pursued him. How Ryan Poles got this done shows a willingness for George McCaskey, the McCaskey family, the leadership of the Bears, to do things differently and to change and to not just fall back into the same patterns that have led to the same mistakes. So we'll look at how this pursuit of Ben Johnson is different and why that sets them up for, if not better results, at least different results, different process, different results, much better than same process, same results. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action, and that's where PrizePicks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, PrizePicks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, you simply pick more or less on player stats, like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns, for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. So if you want to grab Saquon Barkley's rushing or Jaden Daniels passing in this upcoming game, or not even just football, you play PrizePicks for basketball and hockey and soccer and tennis and combat sports. I mean, they've got it all at PrizePicks. Over 10 million members play, and they've won billions of dollars. It's clear that people love playing on PrizePicks. And we've got a special offer for Locked On Bears listeners. Download the PrizePicks app today and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Whether your lineup is successful or not, you're getting $50 added into your account with that promo code LOCKEDONNFL at PrizePicks. Run your game. It wasn't just Ben Johnson, the candidate, that stands out as different this time around. It's not just Ben Johnson's coaching staff and the names he's bringing to Chicago that stand out as different this time around. It's also how Ryan Poles, Kevin Warren, and to some extent George McCaskey went about securing and landing Ben Johnson. That, yes, part of this is being able to pry him away from Tom Brady and the Las Vegas Raiders. Like, if you just think about it overall, like, the Raiders were offering, you get to work under Tom Brady, and the guy knows a thing or two about winning Super Bowls, but more importantly, the Raiders were offering Ben Johnson kind of like his choice of who his boss was going to be, right? The Raiders fired their general manager and were interviewing general managers that Ben Johnson liked. I think part of the idea was like, hey, if you come here, would they let him hand pick his general manager? I don't know, but they certainly would. He would have more say in who his boss is and be on the same timeline as his boss, maybe have a little more power over his boss. We don't know exactly, but that's those sort of the kind of things that were in conversation with the Raiders. And with the Bears, it's Ryan Poles, George McCaskey, Kevin Warren, take it or leave it, and he took it. Like, that's a win. That's a huge win for the Chicago Bears. Maybe it's not as impressive to beat the Jaguars because no one likes Trent Baalke, and Shad Khan seems to be kind of a wild card there. Maybe that's not as impressive of a beating them out, but like, to beat out the Raiders, who are offering Tom Brady and a treasure trove of power and money, says a lot. And maybe it says a lot about Caleb Williams, but I think it also, you got to give Ryan Poles and Kevin Warren credit for properly selling Ben Johnson on this team and this as his landing spot. But I like the way that the Bears ended up taking their time and going through a wide range of candidates, and then the moment Ben Johnson became available, they scooped him up. They acted fast. As far as we know, Ben Johnson has never been inside Hallis Hall. The Bears, as far as we know, it hasn't been reported otherwise yet. It's possible that something happened back channel, back door, whatever, but like, the Bears had a virtual interview with Ben Johnson a couple weeks ago. That's it. They haven't flown him in for an in-person interview. He hasn't been through Hallis Hall. They decided, after just a virtual interview, this is our guy. I don't even think the Bears were necessarily done interviewing other candidates before hiring Ben Johnson. The Bears, as far as we know, had not yet interviewed Marcus Freeman, the Notre Dame head coach, who, well, national championship game maybe not didn't go as well there. Or maybe they did interview him and that distracted him from national championship game. Anyway, the point being, like, there were other candidates the Bears were still working through. The Bears had done 0 second-round candidate interviews. We thought the whole process was going to be, okay, you do virtual interviews with 20 different guys, and then you pick 3 or 4 or 5 guys to be finalists, bring them in person, and then decide who you want to hire. That's how they've kind of done it typically in the past. But the whole point here is that the Bears aren't doing it like they've done it in the past. And that's a sign that things could be different this time around. They're not just following the same structure. Ryan Poles had the authority, the power, whatever it is, from Warren and McCaskey to say, yeah, we haven't talked to Ben Johnson in person yet, but he's my guy. Let's go get him. That doesn't guarantee he's going to be a great head coach, but I like that it's different, because there's nothing worse than trying to do the same coaching, hiring, search process not year after year, but over and over again and expecting different results. Now we've got a different process. So let's hope for some different results. And it feels like the only way the results can be different is being better, right? The results can't get worse necessarily than what the Bears have picked in previous head coaches overall. They empowered Ryan Poles to talk to a bunch of people, and maybe talking to all those different candidates further cemented to him how much he liked Ben Johnson. Because, okay, you talk to Johnson, you're like, wow, this guy's good. And then maybe you talk to 5 other guys who are not very good. And by comparison, you're like, man, every time we talk to one of these other coaches, it just reinforces how much better Ben Johnson was in the hiring or in the interview. I'm not saying that's the case, but that's one of the possibilities here that happens when you talk to so many different coaches is that it starts to separate who really knows their stuff, who's really interviewing well, who really grabs you as a candidate versus the coaches that maybe you're not so interested in. And then the other thing that's different about this is that we don't have an exact number on Ben Johnson's contract, but we know that Ben Johnson was reportedly demanding a high salary, and we're getting early reports that the Bears are paying a high salary, a very high salary for Ben Johnson. Mike Florio from Pro Football Talk reported that the initial number making the rounds on the NFL grapevine is $13 million per year for Ben Johnson, which is a lot higher than any other first-time head coach gets. There was a report from, I don't have it in front of me. I want to say it was Waddle and Sylvie on ESPN Chicago. One of the Chicago radio station report, and I apologize for not being able to give them proper credit here, but they had tweeted out that the Bears got George McCaskey into uncomfortable territory with the price tag on Ben Johnson and that he was still willing to pay up, even despite it being more money than he really wanted to have to spend there. That's change. That's different. That's hopefully a sign of the Bears willing to not like kind of break the bank and willing to break from the norm here as well. That's another aspect of this that I think is really interesting. Like McCaskey has a reputation of being cheap. I don't know that he is cheap, but definitely not someone who we expected to want to pay top dollar for a head coach. While you're already still paying Matt Eberflus's contract, by the way. The coach contracts are usually fully guaranteed, and they still have to pay Eberflus for a couple of years. Now they're paying Ben Johnson a huge sum of money, but there's no salary cap on coaches. So it's purely about how much the ownership is willing to pay out. There's nothing stopping them from spending more other than just their own pocketbooks and the margins on the business or whatever. But the Bears, they paid up for Ben Johnson. They were willing to pay up for Ben Johnson. They were willing to let Ryan Poles hire their guy the day after the guy became available. They were willing to let Ryan Poles hire the guy without an in-person interview in Hallis Hall. They've been willing to do it differently this time. That's why this feels different. I will say again for the umpteenth time, just because it feels different doesn't mean I'm guaranteeing, Ben Johnson's going to be perfect, everything's going to be great. But it's just a nice breath of fresh air to see the organization doing it differently and not just being same old Bears, because same old Bears hire Mike McCarthy today or tomorrow. But, same old Bears hire Mike McCarthy. Same old Bears wait and settle for, I don't know, like Joe Brady or Todd Monken or, whatever it is. Like, same old Bears don't land Ben Johnson. So it's not going to be same old Bears with Ben Johnson. It's not going to be same old Bears with Caleb Williams. And that pairing is going to be obviously the most important thing for at least the next 4 years of Caleb Williams' rookie contract and the key to all of Ben Johnson's successes or failures in Chicago. I want to dive into that relationship and more in depth in what this Lions offense will look like in Chicago on tomorrow's podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button for Locked On Bears on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen today, you can check out any of our other Locked On Podcast Network shows. Because the Bears hired Ben Johnson, I had to fill in, and I was a guest on the Locked On NFL podcast that covers the NFL as a whole. We talked about Ben Johnson of the Bears. I was a guest on the Locked On Sports Today podcast that covers the biggest stories in all of sports, not just the NFL. If you want to hear more of me talking about Ben Johnson, or you can check out any of our other Locked On podcasts for your other favorite sports teams, whether it's the Bulls, Blackhawks, Cubs, or White Sox, or if you have favorite teams in other cities that aren't just Chicago, that's okay too. No judgment here at all. And college sports as well here in the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. So make sure you're coming back tomorrow. Make us your first listen once again. And in exchange, I'll be sure to give you another opportunity to bear down.